Hi, my name is Peter Andras. I am a professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 5, Organism and the Nervous System, and this is part 1 of lecture 5. So, in this lecture, we will look at how we can use this systems theory approach to analyze and understand organisms. We will look at multicellular systems, then we will consider tissues and organs, and then a set of subsystems of the organisms. So let's start with the cells. As we discussed in the previous lecture, the cells can be seen as systems of protein interactions, where proteins interact with other proteins and many other molecules, including RNAs and DNAs. And we said that the cell can be seen as a system of such molecular interactions where the proteins and other molecules act as communication units and their interactions are the communications. And we define the cell as a system of these interactions. Now, in the cells, we said that the communications are spatial temporal patterns of molecular interactions, and there are referencing and continuation rules which determine how these spatial temporal patterns of molecular interactions may follow each other. And if they follow the specific rules of a system, then they form a system which is a cell. We noted that in principle we can consider this language, however in practice we do not have enough experimental data to effectively derive what this language is. We also noted that within the system of the cell, which is seen as a system of molecular interactions, in particular the information subsystem is constituted by the genome, interpreted in a wide sense, where the memory molecule, memory communications are the interactions of the RNAs and of the DNA. And the interaction between RNA molecules and the DNA and supporting proteins form the information subsystem of the cell. So that's what he said about cells seen as communication systems. Now, that view was from the inside of the cell. So if you look at what this system is and how it does behave. Now, if you take an outside view of the cell, then what you see is behaviors of these cells. The cells move, they release molecules, they engulf parts of their environment, and so on. So you can see the cells now from outside as a communication unit, which interact with its environment, generates communication signals and behaviors. These are movements of the cells, or expression of certain molecules on the cell membrane, or release of molecules from the cell. And also the various actions of the cell on the environment, which happen at a more macro scale of the cell, like engulfing bits of the environment, also releasing tentacles, if you like, in the environment, moving in the environment, having mechanical impact on the environment. So, if you look at two cells that interact, then you may see these interactions as communications where one cell interacts with another by, for example, releasing some molecules in the environment which diffuse through the intercellular medium, possibly bind on the surface of the other cell and trigger some behavior in this other cell. So, for example, you may consider two neurons which they communicate, so they have a synapse between them, and through that synaptic junction, molecules are released in the synaptic cleft, in the space between the two neurons. These neurotransmitter molecules then attach to neurotransmitter receptors on the postsynaptic neuron and trigger some changes within this neuron. Or you may have electric junction molecules, which allow the passing of charged ions between the cells, and in this way one cell impacts the behavior of the other cell. So essentially what you see here is a communication between cells. The behavior of one cell is perceived as a communication by the other cell, or the impacts of the behavior on the environment are leading to perception by the other cell. So what you can see is that the cells produce a sequence or a pattern of signals, be that these be their behaviors or their display or release of molecules. And these signals are received by another cell, which has a change in its behavior in response to these signals that are received. So, in general, the signal that the cells generate depends on the state of the cell, what happened in the cell before, what kind of signals they have generated recently, currently, and also what other signals they received from other cells. Now, what's important here is that we look at the cell now from the outside. So we look at the communication behavior of the cell, but we ignore what happens inside of the cell. In the previous lecture, we were focusing on inside of the cell. Now we move outside of the cell, ignore what happens inside. So how these changes, how the signals are generated, how the molecules are released, or how the cell moves. We ignore all these details. So we focus only from the outside of the cell, from the outside perspective of the cell, in the sense that we look at only at the behaviors that are acting as a signal for other cells. Now, in general, it is not possible to produce any kind of behavior after any other kind of behavior within the cell. There are constraints on these, and what are the possible follow-on communication behaviors of the cell depends on the interior mechanisms of the cell. However, because we said that we ignore what happens inside, what we see is a kind of conditional probability distribution over possible continuations. And these are the continuation rules in the context of the signal behaviors produced by the cells. So just for an example, you may consider a neuron which generates a spike. So these are the typical communications that neurons generate. Now, after each spike, there is a so-called refractory period when the neuron is silent. It cannot generate any further spikes. So in the case of neurons, the refractory period behavior is always there after the generation of spikes. So you have quite specific rules about what behaviors may follow and what are their probabilities. So if you consider the communications between cells, the communications depend on what other communications have been generated by the cell itself and what other communications have been received from other cells. So in this way, the cell communication reference previous communications. And these are the referencing rules in the context of cell communications between cells. So for example, a neuron may receive a number of inhibitory and excitatory signals from other neurons. And depending on the pattern of these signals, some induce the neuron to generate something, others induce to not generate signal. But the neuron integrates these incoming signals, calculates inside what is the right response, and generates this right response, which might be a series of spikes in a certain pattern. From looking at it from outside, what we see is a kind of conditional probabilistic rule, which says that certain patterns of incoming signals coming in, so these are the incoming signals from other neurons, and then depending on those, there's a probability to generate a certain pattern, certain temporal pattern of outgoing extrapotentials, spikes, by this neuron which received the inputs. And this may vary. So it has been shown that neurons change how they behave, but the overall long-term behavior of them follows statistical regularities. So, what we said so far is that if you look at the cells from outside, you can see them as communication units, and their behaviors can be seen as communications between cells, which follow certain continuation and referencing rules. And then these communications may form a communication system. So, in multicellular systems, we have many cells which each act as a communication unit, generate the communication between them, which follow some of these referencing and continuation rules. And if these rules are such that they result in a self-maintaining set of intercellular communications, then we have a multicellular system, which is an organism. So we define the organisms as multicellular systems where the communications are interactions between cells, and the cells act as the communication units of the system. So for example, you may consider bacterial biofilms, where bacteria interact with each other, release certain molecules which impact on other bacteria in the biofilm. They stay stuck together in a kind of layer of cells organized on some surface. Or slime mold, which you see on the screen on the right, it is again a multicellular system where, depending on the conditions, a slime mold may form certain patterns of organization of the body. It may form slugs, or it may form individual cells, or they may aggregate together depending on conditions. But in the same way, you may consider various other multicellular systems like sponges, a cat, or a human. Yeah, all fall in this way. All are organisms made of many cells which communicate with each other. Now, let's have a look at how these multicellular systems work and how we can understand them in the context of the systems theory approach. So let's consider a very simple multicellular system, Ninarian hydra. So these live in water. They have relatively simple body structure. They have an inner wall, an outer wall, few tentacles, and the food with which they stuck to the bottom of the sea. The inner wall covers their inner side, which is their gastric system. That's where they digest the food. The outer wall is what covers their outside, that is mainly defending them from possible predators. And their tentacles move around in the water, aiming to manipulate possible food items into the inside of the hydra. So This hydra is essentially the main behavior of them is filter feeding, where they sit in the water, in the sea, move their tentacles. Potentially, if they see some particularly good live food item, they may try to immobilize or kill them with poison that they inject into them. And they try to manipulate with the movement of their tentacles all these food items inside of their inner sac, where they release digestive enzymes and digest it. And then whatever gets released, that comes out with the water from the inside. So what we see is a really simple multicellular organism. Recently, it has been determined that such hydras have in the range of a few tens of different kinds of cells based on the genetic profile of them. So what we see is it's a quite simple organism. So how do we understand this simple organism through our systems theory? Well, what you see here is that we have a number of different kinds of cells. We said a few tens of different kinds of cells, which are organized in this body and generate the behavior of the organism through interactions between them. So, if you look at this multicellular system, this is anything that is outside of the system is the environment of the organism. So there might be communications with other cells. For example, there might be digestive bacteria in the digestive system that communicate with cells in the digestive tract. There might be many other cellular communication outside. There might be other single cell organisms around. If you take the hydra, there are many such organisms, and some of them become prey of the hydra. So overall, what you see is that the cells of the organism interact frequently with other cells of the organism, while they interact much less frequently with other cells which are not part of the organism. So this is the kind of frequency or density boundary of communications which defines where is the boundary between the system and its environment. As I mentioned earlier, in the hydra you have the external layer of the hydra, which is mainly a protective layer. So there we have fewer interactions with other cells outside of the hydra, while inside of the hydra there are more interactions because there in the digestive system certain cells release digestive enzymes which interact with other cells which get digested, or possibly there are interactions with bacteria or other unicellular organisms as well. Now, usually this boundary is well defined as a skin or other kinds of epithelial surfaces in higher animals. In other animals, simple animals, this boundary may be less defined. And there might be more interactions between the cells, other cells, and the cells of the organism. Perhaps to give an example, if you consider plants and the fungi, which interact with the plant roots. Quite often these interactions are quite intricate, and there are many interactions between the plant cells forming the root of the plant and the rhizobia, which are essentially fungi, which help the plant draw nutrients from its environment in the ground. Now, how are the actions of the organism in this context. So essentially the actions can be seen as patterns of intercellular communication. So for example, in the case of the hydra, there are muscle cells which contract and produce a movement as a result of the tentacle, or may get relaxed, and that produces the movement of the tentacle. So, for example, extending or moving, curling the tentacle is an action of the organism which has an impact on the environment. And this happens by a number of communications of cells within the tentacle of the hydra which deliver this particular action. In general, the actions deliver some action and impact on the environment. The communications between the cells which lead to the action are referenced by other communications within the organism, providing in this way reference for further communications within the organism. The perceptions of the organism are the result of the impacts of the environment on the organism. So the environment changes, and this impact induces behaviors in the cells which are seen as communications within the organism. And if these communications are different from the expectations based on earlier communications, then these generate the perceptions of the organism. So, for example, in the case of the hydra, if there is a food particle, for example, another organism that can be consumed by the hydra, if that appears there and possibly indicates itself by releasing some molecules, so the hydra senses the presence of this potential food, then changes the behavior of the hydra, because the molecular, the cellular interactions within the hydra, which previously did not indicate the presence of a potential food item, now change. The sensory cells of the hydra pass on the communications that there is a food item approaching. So the hydra perceives the change in the environment and generates, in accordance with that, a different action, aiming, for example, trying to capture this prey item. Now, as I noted earlier, even in the hydra, there are 40 or so different kinds of cells. So, although these cells all form the organism, they specialize. And the specialization means that they specialize to produce a limited set of the possible communication signals. So, from the perspective of systems theoretic description, what we see is that the conditional distribution of the continuation signals changes, it sharpens. Certain continuation behaviors become much more likely, while other continuation communication signals become much less likely. Now, the mechanism for this specialization is the differential activation of the genome. So different kind of proteins are expressed in some cells, and that leads to different behavior of these cells. So for example, muscle cells have a certain kind of restricted set of behaviors that they produce. They contract, they relax, and they interact with other muscle cells to communicate their behavior to them. While other cells, let's say epithelial cells, interact differently, or cells which are sensory cells or attack cells in the case of Hydra behave differently in accordance with their specialization. So what we can see is that this specialization can be translated effectively as a set of constraints on intercellular communications. So these define structures in the context of the cell system, in the context of the organism as a system of cellular communications. So what we propose here is that these specialized cells, which follow this restricted set of behaviors and communications, these form the tissues of the organism. So in general, these tissues, from the organism's perspective, have some particular special function within the organism. So, for example, muscle cells deal with the contraction and relaxation of the body, or bone cells deal with the building of the bones, and so on. So these cells, which follow the specialized communication rules, they form the tissues within the organism. And these tissues constitute subsystems within the organism, because they follow the organism's rule in general, but they follow these rules with some constraint. And the structure constraints are such that they define these subsets of specialized cells as a subsystem within the system of the organism. So, for example, muscle cells communicate mainly with other muscle cells, and of course also with other cells, and they mainly communicate about behaviors which are specific of the muscle cells. So you have quite intense communication between the cells belonging to the tissue, by much fewer communications with cells which are not part of the tissue. So the language of the tissue system is a specialized version of the organism's language, of the conditional continuation rules and referencing rules that define what kind of intracellular communications may happen. And these are the conditional rules for the continuation rules are sharpened, meaning that some behaviors are much more likely, while many other behaviors become much less likely than in general. So again, if you look at the muscle cells, they focus on communicating about muscle-specific behaviors, stretching and contracting. I do not communicate about other behaviors, let's say about release of molecules that are products aid to immobilize food items or other behaviors that are common in other kinds of cells of the organism. So from the tissue perspective, the environment is the organism itself. There is a communication boundary, although this may not be as explicit boundary as in the case of the overall organism, where there is an epithelial cell surrounding the organism, epithelial cell layer surrounding the organism in most cases. In the case of tissues, there may not be such strict boundaries in physical sense. However, there are boundaries in terms of communications, and quite often these have some level of physical boundary expression as well. So, for example, if you consider nerves and muscle cells, they do communicate with each other. However, they communicate much more with other nerve cells or other muscle cells, depending on which cell they are. Now, as we said earlier, the aim of the systems is to reproduce and expand themselves. So the same applies here, that the organism and its tissues are aimed to reproduce themselves and to expand themselves. Now, the reproduction happens in terms of generating communications of the same kind. And at the same time also we note that some cells die and new cells are regularly produced, and in this way tissues get renewed, at least in the case of most of the tissues. And the reproduction of the tissue system means the reproduction of the communications between these cells. In the same way, the overall organism has a number of cells which die regularly, which cells get reproduced by cell division, but the organism maintains itself by reproducing the communication patterns between the cells that follow the rules of the organism. Now, what we should also note is that the expansion of the organism limits the expansion of its subsystems, the tissues. So, for tissues and bundles into organs, there are limitations in terms of size, shape, organization, and location. And to maintain the self-reproduction of the organism, it is important that these constraints on growth of the tissues are maintained and are imposed. Now, in order to maintain these limits, the communications between cells within the organism limit the growth of tissues. Now, this may happen by programmed cell death or by limiting growth. So, in particular, some cells, when they mature, they no longer are able to divide, so they continue to produce the right communications, the right interactions with other cells, but they do not grow themselves, they do not produce offspring, and after some time these cells die. At the same time, there are other cells in the tissue which are tissue-specific stem cells, which generate new cells within the tissue. Possibly across a number of generations, these new cells are generated until they get into their mature state, when they stop growing further and just deliver the functionality of the tissue by delivering the right communications within the tissue. At the same time, sometimes cells are produced in excess, and it is necessary that these excess cells die, and this is the programmed cell death process, where molecules are released by some cells, which trigger other cells to induce their own destruction. So, in this sense, from the cell's perspective, this is a process which limits its growth and actually leads to its death. However, from the organism's perspective, it is the right way of generating the communications within the organism, because this limitation of growth implies that overall the organism can grow and can reproduce itself. Now, obviously, we have the cases when cell growth goes on without these limitations. And this is the case of the cancers, where some cells lose their ability to participate in the tissue communication system, in particular in the sense of losing their ability to stop growing. And these cells build subsystems within the tissue system, which ultimately becomes an independent system, independent multicellular system with its own rules of communications which diverge from the rules of the organism. In particular, they diverge in terms of responding to the cell that's inducing signals. And this multicellular system expands, disregarding the overall expansion and limitations imposed by the organism. Now, we discussed so far about tissues, but what about organs? So organs are the specialized parts of an organism which perform a special behavior. For example, consider the tentacles of the hydra, or the ear of a cat, or hand of a human, and many other body parts which have some functional specialization, at least from looking at from the outside perspective at an organism. So these organs are made of a multitude of cells belonging to many different kinds of tissues. So, are these organs subsystems of the organism? Well, in a sense, there are some constraints on them. Co-localizations of these cells means that they are more likely to interact with other co-localized cells. However, at the same time, there is also a lot of interaction with other cells. So, for example, blood cells, neurons, lymphatic cells, and so on. So there are also many interactions with other cells other than the local cells. So in this way, all the co-localization may imply some boundary conditions for these cells. Actually, considering all the intercellular interactions, these boundaries are not strong boundaries, and in most cases, organs cannot be seen as subsystems of the organism. There are also the various functional systems within an organism, such as digestive system or locomotor system and others. Now, the question, would we call these functional systems subsystems in the context of our systems theory? And now, essentially, the answer is probably not. The cells that form these functional systems belong to many kinds of tissues. Again, there is co-localization and forming of particular organs that deliver or contribute to the delivery of the functionality of these functional subsystems. However, again, there is a lot of communication with other cells outside of these functional systems, in particular cells carried by the blood, but also neurons, immune cells, and overall we cannot see these functional systems as subsystems as we defined in the context of this systems theory. Now, let's consider now diseases. So effectively, the physiological diseases are disturbances in the intercellular communication. So, for example, the bacteria may produce some toxins, which causes the release of excess water by the cells in the guts, and leads to a disease condition, a diarrhea in this case. So the interactions between the cells do not follow their normal patterns, what is expected, and as a result there is a disturbance and there is an irregular, abnormal behavior of the organism. So in general, we can see these physiological diseases as such disturbances to the intercellular communications, where they don't follow their regular behavior, communication behavior. They produce wrong communications, These wrong communications might be faulty communications, or they may produce a situation where the expected communications between cells cannot be produced, and as a result there is a dysfunctional behavior at the scale of the organism. Now, let's consider what is meaningful communication within the organism. And these meaningful communications are all those intercellular communications which reference previous intercellular communications and provide reference for further such intercellular communications. So as long as these intercellular communications contribute to the reproduction of the organism, they are meaningful communications. At the level of tissues, the constraints are stricter on the intercellular communications. So some intercellular communications may fit within overall in the organism scale pattern of intercellular communications. If they don't fit the tissue-specific communications, they are not meaningful communications. Again, here you may consider the cancer cells, where cancer cells can travel from their original location and can get incorporated in other parts of the body where they can go, which indicates that they can produce the right communications in order to get integrated into some other part of the body. So overall, cancer cells diverge from their tissue-specific communications, but they will still retain to some extent the organism specific communications, such that they can survive in the organism and can grow. So here you see an example where the tissue-specific constraints are no longer maintained, but to a good extent the organism-specific constraints are still fitted by the communications of the cells. Now, as I said, meaningless communications are within the tissues are the communications which may follow the system level, the organism scale communication, but do not follow the tissue-specific communications, such as cancer cells or degenerated muscle cells which do not contract as normally they are expected to contract and relax. And these are meaningless communications in the tissues. At the organism level, the meaningless communications are the intercellular communications which do not respect the language of the organism. So, for example, following viral infection, cells do not communicate as normally expected, and in many cases they actually get killed by some cells, immune cells of the organism, because they detect that they do not follow the normal communications of the cells. So these are the faulty communications within the cells. So to summarize, in this part of this lecture, we looked at multicellular systems. We said that we consider the cells as communication units. We ignore what happens inside of the cells. We focus only on the behaviors of the cells that can be seen as communication behaviors. And we see the cells as abstract communication units, and these behaviors that they produce, which can be the movement of the cell or release of certain molecules, these are the communications of the cell. And we see the multicellular systems, the organisms, as systems of intercellular communications which follow certain continuation and referencing rules. Then we discussed about the tissues, and we said that the tissues are specialist subsystems which have a much narrower range of allowed continuation communications. And through these specialism, they constitute subsystems of the organism, and they deliver subsystem-specific functions within the organism. We noted that organs, they are constituted by colocalized cells, we do not see them as subsystems of the organism, and similarly functional systems like digestive system, circulatory system of the organism are not seen in general as subsystems of the organism. Let's see a few questions. Is it true that cells communicate with each other by generating lipid membranes? And well, the answer is not really. Cells communicate with each other by releasing molecules, by having physical behaviors that have mechanical impact on other cells, or they may pass on ions between them, but in general they do not communicate by generating lipid membranes. Second question, is it true that referencing a multicellular system means that each cell's communication depends on its earlier communication signals and the communication signals of other cells? And yes, this is what we said, that in general what you can see is that if you look at the cell by ignoring what happens inside of the cell, generally what you can see is that the cell's behavior, its communication behavior, depends on what communication behavior the cell received before from other cells, and also depends on what other communication behaviors a cell generated in the past. So in this way, the communication behavior generated by the cell references these other communication behaviors that were generated by the cell before, and other communication behaviors that the cell received from other cells. Next question, is it true that the muscle cells form a tissue system which is a subsystem of the organism? Now, we said that yes, this is true in the context of this systems theoretical analysis of organisms. We said that muscle cells follow a restricted set of continuation and referencing rules, where the continuation rules are sharpened, where only a narrow set of communications are possible between these muscle cells, and effectively form a subsystem of the organism. Next question, is it true that the environment for the muscle tissue is the same as the environment for the whole organism? And well, the answer is no, because the muscle tissue, it is a subsystem of the organism. So the environment for the muscle tissue is the organism itself outside of the muscle tissue, while the environment for the whole organism is anything outside of the organism. So the anything outside of the organism is also part of the anything outside of the muscle tissue system, but the immediate environment of the muscle tissue is the rest of the organism. And only after that comes what is outside of the organism. Next question, is it true that the programmed cell death causes meaningless communications within a tissue? What about this in the context of a cell system? Well, what we said is that the programmed cell death is a necessary part of how tissues develop. Sometimes there are excess cells produced in tissues, and these excess cells or dysfunctional cells need to be eliminated, and in these cases, programmed cell death is induced in them, which effectively leads to the death of these cells. However, from the perspective of the tissue communication, inducing programmed cell death, it is a meaningful communication. In the context of the cell system, which is affected, where the cell system is self-destroying, well, clearly the communications induced by the programmed cell death communications from outside of the cell are meaningless communications from the cell's perspective. So ultimately, this destroys the cell as a system. So from cell's perspective, the programmed cell death involves meaningless communications. Next question, is it true that organs constitute subsystems of an organism? And we said that this is not the case, so this is not true. We said that organs, although they contain colocalized cells, these cells have many interactions with neurons, blood cells, and other cells, which means that there is no such definite communication density boundary around organs, so they do not constitute subsystems in the sense of the systems theory that we are discussing. Next question. Is it true that physiological diseases can be seen as generation of meaningless communications within some local tissue? And yes, that's what he said there. Given that physiological diseases means that cells do not behave in their normal way, effectively this means that there are meaningless communications behaviors of cells which do not fit the normal behaviors of the organism. So indeed, what this means is then that physiological disease can be seen as the generation of meaningless communications within some local tissue. Thank you.